Doctrine and Covenants 109 through 110. In December 1832 and January 1833, Joseph Smith received a revelation instructing the saints to establish a house of God. However, you might remember that 6 months later, there was still no house of God under construction. The Lord chastened the saints, saying, "Wherefore ye must needs be chastened, and stand rebuked before my face, for ye have sinned against me a very grievous sin." In other words, the Lord had amazing blessings just waiting for the saints, and they were delaying their own blessings by their failure to act. Well, luckily, Joseph Smith got the message, and within 5 days of that revelation, construction on the Kirtland Temple began. When the saints began building the Kirtland Temple, there were only about 150 church members living in Kirtland. With so few saints, it was difficult to find qualified builders, afford materials, and find the time to build the magnificent building they'd planned. To make matters even more difficult, in the middle of their work on the temple, the men were called to join the camp of Israel to address the grievances of the saints in Missouri. Women in Kirtland carried on the work as well as they could, doing masonry work, driving teams, and more, but the temple project likely felt like it would take forever. However, after Zion's camp returned in the fall of 1834, building the temple became the saints' top priority. Blessedly, new converts continued moving to Kirtland, until there were about 2,000 saints in the area, many of whom were skilled in masonry, carpentry, and architecture. These talented saints were immediately put to work. Finally, after nearly 3 years of sacrifice, the dedication of the temple on March 27, 1836 was a true celebration. Though the temple doors weren't set to open until 8 a.m., people began lining up at 7. In fact, the crowd was so large that a second session and overflow areas were quickly organized. Joseph, Oliver Cowdery, Sidney Rigdon, and 2 scribes met the day before to finalize everything. The next day, Sidney Rigdon spoke for about 2.5 hours prior to the dedicatory prayer, and then he presented Joseph to the congregation, who sustained him as prophet and seer. Joseph took the stand again to call for sustaining church leaders, and then read the dedicatory prayer, which had been given to Joseph by revelation, and was read aloud by him at the pulpit. A choir sang the newly written hymn, "The Spirit of God," and the meeting concluded with the saints giving the Hosanna shout 3 times. The spirit that filled the first temple in this dispensation is probably impossible to imagine. Multiple people testified that angels were seen in the temple during and after the dedication. That day and over the following days, spiritual manifestations occurred, including visions, people speaking in tongues, and visitations of angels. Benjamin Brown wrote to his wife about seeing a cloud rest on the temple and 3 personages with bright keys in their hands hovering in the room. But the glorious visions and miracles weren't over when the dedication finished. In the dedicatory prayer, Joseph had asked the Lord to accept both the workmanship of the temple and the sacrifices of the saints. He also prayed that the Lord would manifest himself there. That prayer was answered quite literally. 1 week after the dedication, on April 3, 1836, Joseph and Oliver joined a large congregation in the temple. After a morning meeting and an afternoon sacrament service, Joseph and Oliver withdrew to the elevated pulpits at the west end of the lower court. They drew the veils and bowed in silent prayer. What followed was a marvelous and sacred vision. To the amazement of both Joseph and Oliver, the Savior, Jesus Christ, appeared before them and declared that he had accepted the temple. Then came Moses, Elias, and Elijah, each committing keys necessary for the restoration. It's almost unimaginable how these men must have felt as biblical heroes and their own Savior stood before them and passed on to them the keys of the kingdom. Elder David A. Bednar taught that these visitations marked the beginning of a new phase of the restoration. Prior to this moment, Joseph had the priesthood, but not all the necessary keys. In other words, he had power, but not yet permission. With these keys, the church began to roll forward with even greater haste. And with the visit of the Lord, Joseph was reminded of this truth. The Lord will manifest himself to us as we serve and worship him in the temple. He did it for the early saints, and he'll do it for us in the ways we most need today. And that's what's happening in Come Follow Me this week.